all of whom are getting PhDs, I'm happy to say. Jennifer Sell, whose field is political science, and she's going to talk about services for the people.
Thanks. No. Good afternoon. As Eric mentioned, I'm one of the social scientists on the TIER initiative, and what I'm going to be presenting today is a small portion of the dissertation work that I did as a part of this group. I am one of the social scientists, so I'm going to be presenting largely observations and not my own technologies. There's lots of technologies to observe in India, so that's what we're going to talk about today. In general, delivering public services is a fundamental activity of government, but it's one that is often inherently flawed. As the World Bank notes, in developing countries, services are often either inaccessible to citizens, or if they are accessible, they're of very poor quality. I have a few images that will help you to understand the experience of citizens in developing countries in their attempts to access services. Here we see citizens attempting to renew their ration card, a key government service in India that allows people below the poverty line to access subsidized food. These people are in line trying to get to a bureaucrat who will help them to renew their ration card. Once they get to the bureaucrat, this is often the bureaucrat that they face. A single bureaucrat in an office piled high with paper files. Now we can all imagine the difficulty that this might pose for service delivery. Paper files in and of themselves may slow the process of service delivery, and the interaction between a single citizen and bureaucrat can create opportunities for the extraction of rents from citizens, that is, bribes. So the question broadly that I ask in this project is, why do governments provide public services, and what are the conditions under which governments will be incentivized to reform public service delivery? Now, as many of us recognize here today, the rise of information and communication technologies in the 1990s really sheds new light on these questions. Information technologies are seen as tools for reforming the entire process of service delivery, from the files at the beginning of the process all the way through to the delivery of services to the citizen. And this use of information technologies for improving government service delivery, particularly developing countries, has been a key focus of the international development community over the 15 years. International organizations such as the World Bank and the UNDP, in addition to major international corporations such as Microsoft and Accenture, have dedicated both large amounts of intellectual and monetary capital to trying to address these questions. So the question that we're faced with at the end of all of this interest and activity and support for these kinds of interventions is, why do we see significant variation in government adoption of what is now often referred to as e-services? I address these questions in the context of the Indian states. In India, there's been a huge amount of activity to implement information technologies in government service delivery, and the key model that's been used for this process is what I'm terming a technology-enabled service center, or an information kiosk, a citizen service center, a citizen information center, whatever you want to call it. These are centers where computers and the internet are used to, we hope, deliver services to citizens. Now, there are a wide range that could be delivered to this model. Everything from driver's licenses, often in India arms licenses, things like birth certificates and residency certificates that are fundamental for accessing additional government services. Basic welfare benefits can be delivered through this model, in addition to transactional services like paying your electricity bill. All activities where citizens have to go to a government office, and instead they could go to one single office where multiple services are available from multiple departments in, one would hope, a more efficient manner. But again, we see considerable variation across the Indian states in how these policies to implement service centers have been implemented. That's the variation that I hope to explain to you today, at least in part. Now, there are lots of explanations for why we might see this kind of variation, and I'm happy to address some of the alternatives in the Q&A. But in the time that I have here, I want to present my own explanation for this variation. So the argument that I make is that politicians are using these technology policies in whatever way they can to increase their chances of being reelected. And in order to do this, they have to consider both the potential electoral benefits from providing improved services to citizens, but also the potential electoral costs. Now, the benefits are perhaps obvious. I've mentioned these of service delivery. There are difficulties related to the time it takes to access, also important monetary difficulties related to bribes that are frequently paid to access services in India. Transparency International has estimated that 60% of Indian citizens have paid a bribe to access some government service, and that this amounts to at least $5 billion in bribes being paid on a yearly basis. But there is early evidence that information and communication technologies can be used to reduce this corruption. So the idea then is that citizens will benefit from these improved services, and they will reward politicians electorally in future elections for providing these public goods. However, there are also electoral costs from decreased corruption. It's bureaucrats that are taking bribes from citizens, but politicians have control over those bureaucrats and are able to skim large portions of bribes for their own use. Now that's a system in India that I'm happy to describe in more detail in the Q&A, but the important thing here is that politicians have access to these corrupt funds and that they then have the ability to use those funds in future election campaigns. So incumbent politicians from their bureaucratic underlings and then use these funds to run what have increasingly become very expensive campaigns for re-election at the state level in India. So the takeaway then is that as these bribes are threatened from the potential introduction of information technology, politicians in corrupt states may face then what they see as a threat to their ability to run future election campaigns, reducing their incentives to implement these technologies. So based on this argument, what do I expect to see in terms of policy variation in the Indian states? Well, I expect that levels of corruption in the states and also characteristics of electoral competition should help us to understand the variation in policies that we observe. In states that are highly corrupt, we should expect to see fewer policies, and if we do see policies, they should be less robust than those policies in less corrupt states. In addition, services, individual services with a high potential for corruption should be less likely to be implemented regardless of the demand for those services from citizens, and this is particularly likely to be the case in highly corrupt states. In addition, services with a high potential for electoral benefit, services that are of a high demand, should be more likely to be implemented because there's a greater chance for electoral benefits from those services holding corruption constant. But I don't have the time to talk about that today, but we can talk about that in a Q&A. So how do I test this argument? As I mentioned, this argument is actually both developed and tested in the Indian case. I do a controlled comparison of state-level technology policies in India. This is based, the argument itself is based on initial fieldwork in total set of fieldwork in 16 states and initial fieldwork in 7 states. All of this was supported by the TIER initiative. Thank you very much. And then I tested the argument in an additional 9 states, doing additional interviews in those 9 states. I end up with an entire data set based on more than 70 interviews with government and non-governmental officials of information on policies in 20 states overall. In the broad project that I won't be able to present all of today, I look at variation using this data set in a wide range of policy characteristics, including the timing of policy implementation, the quantity and type of services, and the number of these service centers that have been implemented in states. Today, I really only have time to talk about the quantity of services. I can also talk about the type of services in the Q&A if that's something that interests you. So the quantity of services. This graph presents the total number of services that are provided in the 16 states in my sample that implemented a state-level technology policy. You see on the far right, we have Andhra Pradesh, which implemented more than 41 services in its centers. So you can go to an e-Seva center in Hyderabad and access more than 40 government services from a wide range of departments. Contrast that with the state of Tamil Nadu, farther on the left, the neighboring state of Andhra Pradesh, which offers at best 10 services. Now this is a very crude measure in a way of the quality of services that are provided and the benefits that are provided to citizens, but it does give you a general sense of the robustness of these policies and of the potential benefits to citizens if we assume that more services in general provides a greater opportunity for citizens to benefit from improved service delivery. So what explains this variation in services? Here we have all of the 16 states listed. On the left-hand side are the states that have below average levels of bureaucratic corruption. On the right-hand side are those with above average levels of bureaucratic corruption, according to a survey by Transparency International. In parentheses are the number of services that are offered in each of those states. Now here I conduct a simple difference of means test to determine whether there's any difference in the number of services provided in below average versus above average corruption states. Here you see the difference in the mean number of services in 9.5. This is statistically significant at the 0.05 level and provides good evidence that the level of corruption in a state is closely related to the number of services that are being made available to citizens. Now there might be other reasons why we see this variation in the quantity of services. Here I present data on two alternative explanations for quantity of services. In the second row down, we see the relationship between state domestic product per capita, a measure of economic development, and the quantity of services. We might expect that more economically developed states would provide a larger number of services to their citizens, if only because they would have greater capital available to invest in these initiatives. That doesn't happen to be the case. We actually see that less economically developed states on average provide more services than more economically developed states, but this is not a difference that's statistically significant. We also see the years since policy implementation. We might also think that states that implemented these policies early had longer to introduce more services to their citizens. That doesn't seem to be the case in a way that is statistically significant. So what do we conclude from this brief look into the relationship between political characteristics or the presence of corruption in Indian states and the ability of states to implement communication technologies to improve service delivery? Well, I would argue that new technologies do provide opportunities to reduce corruption. There's early evidence of that, and it seems that politicians perceive this to be the case. And in a place like India and in the developing world in general, this is an opportunity that presents multiple billion-dollar opportunity to benefit citizens who are attempting to access government services. But the reality is that the outcome of these initiatives, no matter how much money has been put into them, is that it is the incentives of politicians that affect whether or not citizens are benefiting from these initiatives. And so if we're really trying to understand the characteristics of the digital divide broadly, either across countries or within countries, what we need to be doing, at least in part, is paying greater attention to how political incentives influence technology outcomes. Thank you.
Does it work? Okay. Yeah, just comment about your first bullet. So you think that new technology present an opportunity to break cycle of corruption. Have you thought about the counter effect? Can it be a thing that boosts corruption more?
Yeah, I would say
how to deal with that?
I'm not sure I know how to deal with it exactly, but I do think that it is possible, and that simply implementing a technology system without thinking interacts with the bureaucratic processes that are in place does absolutely nothing. I mean, we understand that from interventions of technology in the corporate world, and I think those same things apply to using technologies to intervene in bureaucratic processes, yeah? In addition to the political processes that oversee those bureaucratic processes. And I think one case, I think there's been research done on the Bhumi initiative, which is a land record digitization initiative in the state of Karnataka in India that shows that corruption has moved in certain ways, that basic parts of the process are less corrupt, but that citizens are interacting and that they're encountering different kinds of corruption than they encountered earlier. And so while I did say my study to date has not attempted to evaluate whether or not technologies do reduce corruption. That's something that I'm hoping to do additional research on. But the evidence that's out there from other studies does lead us to suggest in general that there's potential. But I think obviously you need to think about what the processes are and what the effects might be to see if that's feasible.
If I recall your graph correctly, you had Himachal Pradesh and Chhattisgarh is very high on the list of, in terms of policy of services provided. Mm-hmm. Could it be that in states so rural and so backward in terms of communications and infrastructure, this doesn't actually mean anything? Okay, so the government has a policy and a lot of services are offered, but nobody can actually access it.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and that's why another part of the project is trying to look at the number of centers that are actually implemented per capita. Or percentage of users that can access it. I would argue, based on the interview that I did in Himachal Pradesh, I think that at the very least the Secretary of IT there understands very clearly how IT could be used in a difficult environment like Himachal and is attempting to drive this policy so that it really reaches the most difficult parts of the Himalayas that he needs to reach these centers. But he sees it as he sees it as an opportunity to reach those people who rarely reached rather than a constraint, though he doesn't recognize it as a constraint. So I think it's difficult no matter what. And I put Chhattisgarh there. I haven't actually been to Chhattisgarh, unfortunately. For security reasons, I didn't go there on my last trip. But my guess is that the quantity of services that you can access there is largely in urban areas and not in the rural areas. I mean, I highly doubt that in the Naxalite areas that these centers are operational. So.
There are many urban areas.
Yeah.
In Himachal, there isn't a single city.
No, but I've been to these centers in Shimla, so the exception. But I would have to go. I haven't been outside of Shimla to actually observe the centers. My understanding is that they are operational in other districts.
Are there other places in the world where you're planning to test this, or
yes,
places where you think it'd be interesting to test it?
Absolutely. So as a part of the project, I've also done research in South Africa and Brazil, and those pieces of the project are a little bit less developed and still sort of under construction, but I've done the initial field work for both of those countries. And I think in Brazil in particular, what's going to be interesting is to understand how the different bureaucratic structures and different political structures interact with the incentives of politicians. And I think the history of corruption in Brazil is different in public service delivery, but there is a high level of electoral competition there. So understanding how I think the general political interest story will generalize, but the specifics will depend on the characteristics of the factors I'm looking at. Yeah. And so give me 6 months, and I'll get back to you.